In this video we're going to learn about the CSV module in Python, and we're going to learn how to read in CSV files into our applications. CSV files, this stands for comma separated values, and as it says in the Python documentation, it's the most common import and export format for spreadsheets and databases. So it's important to know how to work with CSV files. So we'll see that in this video, and we're going to work with an example from 𝗬𝗂𝗂𝗧. Notably, it's the monthly mean carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere. So we're going to download this CSV file. This will be linked in the description, and we can work with that file. So if we go to VS Code, I've created 3 variations of this file so we can see different techniques, and the one you get from the website is this one here, CO2_comments, and it has a lot of comments before the actual data itself. This is the data here, and as you can see it's comma separated, which is the definition of a CSV file, and there are values under these columns here. So we'll see how to read that in later on, and I have a couple of other variations here. So let's start by importing the CSV module, and we'll set the file that we're going to work with to begin with. It's going to be co2.csv, and that's this file here. There are no comments or headers at the top. We just have the actual header values and then the raw data underneath that. So let's see how to read that in using the CSV module. So what we'll do is we'll open the file. So we'll use the with open statement in Python, and we'll pass the file to that, and we'll open that in read mode, and we'll give that a name of CSV file. We open that file, and then what we're going to do is set up what's called a reader object from the CSV module. So we'll call it reader, and it's going to be a csv.reader object, and we pass to it the CSV file. This creates this CSV file reader object, and then we can iterate over each row in the reader. So for row in reader, and we can print that row out and see what we get. So if we save that, and we can execute this script with python script.py, you get the data printed out in rows. And if we break in the for loop, we can see that the first row is actually the headers. So let's save that and execute, and that's the header rows there. So we can read in the data, we get the headers in the first row, and then all rows after that are the actual data itself. So we use the csv.reader object in order to do that. So if we wanted to get the headers, what we can do is we can actually extract those here, and we'll use the next built in and pass the CSV reader to that. And that's going to iterate through the first line of the CSV data, which we know contains the headers, and it will return the values in that line within this headers variable here. So that is useful to know. And then the rest of the rows are the data. So that is how we can get the headers out of that, and then we can get the rest of the rows as data. So if we print out the headers here, we should see that that prints to the terminal, and the row prints below that, which is coming from the for loop. And we break out here, but that would continue and read all of the data. So that's how easy it is to read CSV files in Python. We use a reader here, but one problem is we don't necessarily know what each of these values is representing in the data. So there's another construct called a dictionary reader in the CSV module. So it's the csv.DictReader object, and if we use that, we are assuming that the first row is containing the headers, and as you can see, that is the case in this file. And what we can do there, if it doesn't contain headers, is you can actually pass field names as another argument here and set that to a tuple or a list containing the actual headers you want to use in your dictionary. Now we have headers in our file, so let's remove that, and we can save this. And if we go back here, what that means is that the resulting dictionary will have keys with these values here of year, month, average, and so on. So let's see what happens if we execute this script with the dictionary reader. We can get rid of the headers because they are now being put into dictionary keys. And if we iterate over the reader, we will see what happens below here. So we have now, instead of just raw values, we have a dictionary returned here for the row. And as you can see, each key corresponds to one of the headers, and the values are the actual data that occurs underneath in the data part of the CSV file. So if we stop breaking out of that for loop and save the file, we should see multiple dictionaries being returned on the terminal, as you can see here. And that represents our data, and instead of just a list of values, we know what each value represents, which can be very useful in our applications. And that's the main benefit of the dictionary reader object in the CSV module. And remember, you can use this with a CSV file even if it doesn't have these headers, and you can do that by passing the field names argument to the constructor here and setting that equal to a sequence containing the header values that you want to use. So let's move on and see another example. I've been using this file here Let's now see the skip1 file, and as you can see, this contains one row which has no useful information, and we want to skip over that instead of processing it as part of the CSV file. So the question is, how do we do that? Now, we saw previously that when we wanted to get the headers out of this row, when we were using the csv.reader, not the dictionary reader but the other one, we saw that we actually called the next function, and that would return the objects in the first row to our variable, which was the headers variable. We can actually apply the same function. So let's change the name of this file. It's going to be co2_skip1.csv, and what we're going to do is when we read in the CSV file, we can actually call the next function directly on the CSV file. Now, this is a file handler. It's a file-like object in Python, and that's an iterator that we can call next on as well. So when we call next on that, it's going to advance the file to the second line here, and then we can read in the file as normal and process it. So let's see what happens now. If we clear the terminal and execute the script, I'm going to break below this for loop, save the file, and we see that we get the first row of data containing the average of 315.70, and that's what we want to see here. You can see it's this row here, so that works fine. What happens if we comment out our call to next here? If we save that and re-execute, we get this output here, and it's not correct. We have something weird going on here. We don't want that, and the reason that that's happening though is because when we don't skip the first row, we're trying to read that in as a dictionary key. We're trying to read it as part of the CSV file, and that doesn't work. So we need to call the next function here, and that will advance the file and get to the proper first row, which is the second row in this case. And these types of tasks are actually important to know about because you don't always get your CSV file in a perfect format. Sometimes you need to skip these rows in order to actually get to the data that you want. So let's look now at this final file here. It's co2comments.csv, and this is the actual file that comes from the 𝗬𝗍𝗶𝗹 website, and it contains 51 lines of comments before the actual data. So we're going to see how to skip over all of that in this section of the video. So let's go back to our file here, and if we change the name of this to co2_comments.csv, we should be able to read that in and see what happens now. So if I execute this, we get this line here. This is the second line. We're skipping the first here, and if we go to this file, we get this line of text here. We don't want that. We want to skip now, I think it's 51 rows of data, and that gets us to where we want to actually start getting the data into this program. So if we want to skip 51 rows, what we can do is we can actually call next 51 times. Now, you could write 51 lines of this, but that's not very maintainable. It's not very concise and elegant. We're programmers, so we're going to write a for loop here. So we could say for underscore in range 51, and then we can put the next call within the for loop. And if we save that, we should hopefully see that when we execute this, we get the first row of data, and we do. And there's another way we can do this too. If we want to use the itertools module, we could import from itertools the islice function. So we import that here, and rather than calling this for loop 51 times, what we can do is when we create the DictReader, we can actually slice up the iterator that represents the CSV file. So what I'm going to do is pass the islice function in here, and we pass to that the CSV file. Now, if we go to the documentation for islice, we should be able to see the parameters it takes. Now, the first parameter is the iterable, and that is the CSV file itself. The second two parameters here, we can specify a stop, but we're going to actually specify a start and a stop here. Now, we want to start slicing from line 51 of this CSV file, and we'll specify none as the stop parameter, which means that this will iterate through to the end of the CSV file. So I think that this line here is a little bit more elegant than the for loop that we had before. So let's see if it works when we call script.py. It does. We see we get the same data back that represents the first line of our CSV data. So that is another way to do it. We use the islice function, and that basically wraps up this video. These are different techniques for reading in CSV files in Python, and we can skip rows using the next built in, or we can use islice to actually slice up the iterator here and start wherever we want and stop wherever we want in the CSV file. Now, as a final bonus, let's see how we can use pandas for this operation as well. Pandas is very commonly used in data analysis to read in CSV data and do operations on that data. Now, unlike the CSV module, Pandas is not part of Python's standard library, so you need to install it with pip. And we can do this on our terminal with python 3-m pip install pandas, and if you're on Windows it might just be Python. That will collect pandas and install it on your system, and then you can use that in your application. And once pandas is installed, we can reduce this to a single line of code. So let's create a variable called df, which stands for data frame, and we're going to say pandas.readscsv, and we'll pass the file to that. And we can also pass a keyword argument called skip rows, and we set that equal to 51, and that will tell pandas that we're going to skip 51 rows when we read this file in. And finally, we will not set an index column from the file. So we then can print this data frame's head, and we'll print the first 10 records, and that should then print that to the terminal. Now, of course, we also need to import pandas at the top, so we'll import pandas as PD, and that's the pd.readscsv function here. That comes from pandas. So once we save this, we can execute the script, and we should see the first 10 rows of a data frame from the CSV file. And you see that here we have our column names, and we have the data as rows within the data frame. So we can do this all on a single line of code with pandas, but you don't always have access to pandas in your workplace or whatever you're doing. It's quite a big library as well, so you don't always want to install it. So it's also very useful to know about the CSV module and what it actually offers as well. So that's all for this video. We've learned about the CSV module, and we've seen how to read CSV files with the reader object as well as the dictionary reader object as well. And we've also seen how to skip rows using the next built in and using the islice function from itertools. And finally, we've seen how to use pandas if we have access to that in order to read a CSV and skip rows if need be, and print that out as a data frame to our terminal. So thank you for watching. If you've enjoyed the video, please like and subscribe to the channel, and we'll see you in the next video.